Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast on competition law in digital markets in Latin America by the Center for Entertainment, Technology and Information Law, CENTI. We are here today to discuss the key issues, relevant topics, and the proposed solutions by experts on competition and innovation policy in Latin America. The purpose of this project is to open the debate in society and policy making regarding how to approach regulation and enforcement in digital markets. To lead this discussion, we have invited some of the most experienced professionals in competition, technology, and innovation to help us lead this debate. Moving to our second topic and moving forward, now we would like to address relevant market definition and theory of harm. As you all know, relevant market is the framework in order to analyze potential market failures and competition matters if they can be somehow separated, and how this can be particular to digital markets. This is very important, and it relates to the history of how digital markets or how digital companies have evolved, because we all agree on how fast this has happened. The challenges, as Elisa was mentioning, in different jurisdictions regarding adoption and development of different business models, and how this varies country from country. So basically, we're trying to understand that if we have all these competition matters in traditional markets, if you want to call it that way, if you can actually make a distinction between now traditional economy and digital economy, how do we address these issues? And one of the most recurring debates regards, is each platform a market on its own? How do we define markets in and digital platforms? And of course, there's a lot of thought from two-sided markets, but I would like to give the word to Daniel so he can address this recurring topic on how market definition and digital platform definitions, and if we're talking about regulation or enforcement, what should we take into account with this matter?
So this is a really important topic for which we don't have consensus, right? Basic questions you raise is, do you look at all sides of the platform, or do you look for separate markets on each side of the platform? How do network effects play in this stage, as in part of the market definition or part of the competitive effects? What are the aspects that we would look at? There are limits to traditional SNP tests that so many different jurisdictions use. We have a little bit more guidance in the EC on this with regards to the notice with regards to how to think about these kinds of issues. In the United States, we have a little bit of this in draft merger guidelines, but mostly we have a handful of cases, and we have how this is done all the time, largely in mergers, where we don't actually get a clear and consistent answer. And I would say this is the case across jurisdictions. So in terms of modern digital platforms, the first significant case actually came in China, Tencent versus Jiho 360. This is often forgotten. This was in 2013. Most of the people tend to focus on American Express, a case in the United States in front of the Supreme Court, 2018. This case is complicated. It's complicated because they come up with a definition of two-sided markets that didn't look like anything that suggested the learning in economics and adjacent fields of what a two-sided market looked like. The other question is, would this be applied narrowly to a subset of markets, what they call transaction platforms. And here in American Express, it was specifically with regards to vertical restraints involving anti-steering, or did it deal with a broader set of platforms? Well, we got a little bit more of that in the Sabre case, where it was applied in a merger setting. But the basic question is sort of, I guess, is first, what is a platform, right? You are on, it's something that somehow intermediates two different sides. So we can think of platforms in number settings. So one would be credit cards, boring, old economy. We could look at dating, boring, old economy. Or we could look at dating apps or fintech doing exactly what we just talked about, which are, not boring. Why? New economy. But both old and new economy, they're platforms. We're looking at some kind of interconnection across two or more sides. Sometimes we've heard this term as intermediaries. That was the term in the 1990s. Networks in the 1980s. In the 2000s, it was actually two-sided markets until we realized there were more than two sides. Then we moved to platforms. Now we're thinking about platform ecosystems. But the basic understanding is roughly the same. And unfortunately, we do not have any consistent way of thinking about this across cases. And it's an area of concern. So what are the kinds of things that we would look at? So first of all, do we have the same definition across industries, even when the type of network effects may be different? The answer is not really. So I think we can say A, it's particularly challenging. B, we then have to figure out what are the metrics that we would use to measure the platform effects. We would think about, when we get to the actual effects, justifications, right? But the legal framework, I guess, Victor, to your other question of how do you define these markets, is actually complex because we have, frankly, very few cases and the kind of guidance that we would want to have. Now, the good news is a lot of the way that we think about two-sided markets or platform market definition is very similar to what we've been doing for 100+ years, right? We define a market and we try to figure out what's going on the market. So the fundamental question is, are we looking at each side of the platform separately, or on net, looking at the effects of all the sides? This we still have not resolved. We may have additional issues that come up in a platform setting that are more, to use other terminology, which is also imprecise for its own reasons. Some are more horizontal, some are more vertical. Sometimes we're told that they're transactional, sometimes they're not. How we define a platform itself and sort of the nature of the platform, is it, say, social, or is it some kind of e-commerce platform, also will come into play. Unfortunately, what I'm here to tell you is we don't really have the kind of certainty that we, frankly, might want.
Okay. Well, thank you, Daniel. Hearing the different type of approaches to digital platform and their particularities, one way of trying to characterize them, to define them, is by their impact or by the effects they're having. And here I would like to turn the microphone again to Elisa to see, based on her experience, how do we assess the impact of these platforms? We're talking about adoption, we're talking about business users, we're talking about end users. We have all sorts of goods, services, content here being delivered. So based on your experience, what has been the effect of this group of digital platforms in Latin America?
So I think that for a long time, we could keep these markets separate. The digital and the analog market happen separately in the world. But that is no longer the case. Brick and mortars and digital markets are increasingly intertwined. And I think that has posed problems for antitrust authority. So you could look at Amazon as having nothing to do with Walmart. You could look at banks having nothing to do with fintech, like different products that were spin-offs somehow. But I think that the problem that we face increasingly is that it's very difficult to separate these things. And I also think that this idea of wanting to define everything as a platform, partly because of Danny's example, which I liked, you don't want to do an investigation into dating, but dating apps, that's a very different thing. I think that has brought problems, and I'm thinking particularly, and I'm going to think of like two specific cases, which I think is useful so that I sort of bring this conversation a little further down. So I think of the corner shop Walmart and then corner shop Uber transaction in Latin America that was seen by the Chilean and by the Mexican authority. So I think that posed different problems that were seen through a different lens by each authority. On the one hand, the Walmart corner shop transaction was a brick and mortar versus a purely platform business. But then you had the Uber corner shop transaction, which were two platforms. And in Mexico, this even created a further problem, which was you had the Federal Telecommunications Institute raising its hand and saying, two platforms, that's my venue. That's not COFECE's venue. That's a different antitrust address. So we had a part of a subset of the story was these two regulators fighting it out with the specialized tribunals over who should review this merger. But I think that that posed different ideas because you have a regulator that has been focused on brick and mortar and has been looking at consolidation in the retail market and concerned with that and bringing in those concerns to a digital market that is very small, that is just growing, that it's in a phase in innovation where it needs funds to continue growing, but it's very dynamic. You still can't completely define the market. So initially, COFECE, for example, defined the market as only fresh produce and grocery, and then it became clear that you also had Rappi, which was this very important Colombian platform that not only delivers groceries, it delivers everything. Restaurants. So then it had to sort of modify the way it was looking at the market. And I think regulators are not quite used to being as dynamic in the middle of a case with ways of looking at the case that are different. And I think that in that sense, the Chilean regulator, the Fiscalía, was a lot more open to looking at markets where what was really happening was competition for the market rather than competition in the market. It was much more open to looking at the dynamism of the market and not be as specific and concerned with this. And but I think right now what we have is a learning process. We also have, and to give my second example in fintech, we also have fintechs that obviously disrupt incumbents. The banking system is not happy about having these new entrants that are disrupting, and the regulators are also concerned with not being able to regulate closely these new disruptors as they do the banking sector. But I think precisely the fact that they're not regulated makes them increasingly interesting for consumers, and that's why they're willing to use their services. So we had the fintech law in Mexico, which tried to regulate fintechs in the same way as banks. So then what was the purpose of having these new entrants trying to do something different and disrupting? Brazil, for example, has been very successful in pushing fintechs, in spite of having the central bank very involved in the sector. But it did so at a moment where there was very little fintech growth, whereas in Mexico, having the central bank do this right now is very disruptive because it's crowding out a business that has already grown. So I think timing is very important, and sometimes government intervention can do more harm than good. And this sort of crowding out stymies innovation in the region, and that's a concern. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Elisa. Yeah, there's a general idea that something has to be done, that there's some action that is required from the governments, from enforcement agencies, from legislators regarding this phenomena. I would like to hear to ask Krisztian, what are your thoughts on why is this action being required? What is the theory of harm? What is the issue that people are trying to identify or identifying in these markets?
Thank you, Victor. It's such an important question, and I'm really glad that you asked about this, because it also goes back to kind of like the core and basic point that Danny made. Like, are we talking about competition issues here? Are we talking about potentially issues that would be more related to other policy areas? On the one hand, what we really see is potentially many of the challenges that, regulators, enforcers, policymakers, even legislators might have raised. They potentially show, kind of like the deep interrelationship of some of the issues that we face among different policy areas. They might touch on, competition and competition policy, data protection, privacy, intellectual property, national security. It's really consumer protection, of course. So it's really a broad range of potential policy areas that we might want to look at more closely from the perspective of what are the issues that are being discussed or have potentially been identified. But then on the other hand, and this is the really important element here, is we really have to really focus on the theory of harm. Are we talking about, and that's why it's so important here, are we talking about a theory of harm from a competition perspective, or potentially, a data privacy or a data protection related issue? And that's what I think is the key concern that I see working with a number of jurisdictions, on even these proposed ex-ante regulatory frameworks or so in a number of jurisdictions, which might be at different stages. I think many of them will likely not get adopted, but we really see a significant debate about how, different legislators or regulators should go about regulating this space. And what I also see is often, using competition tools or a competition hammer to address issues that likely are not necessarily competition ones. An example is privacy. There has been a lot of discussion in Europe and worldwide, for example, about some investigations, done by European competition authorities, whether it's, the Bundeskartellamt's Facebook investigation that people have been talking about and commenting, whether it kind of like mixes, competition objectives into competition enforcement with privacy and other elements. But also we see in a number of other jurisdictions, the focus of the discussion is perhaps more related to online harms or content moderation or other issues. And what we see is how so-called national agendas or national digital agendas and programs are being built. We also see the element that as part of these discussions, competition and regulation, they really don't exist in a political vacuum. Some of these proposals and regulatory frameworks are being discussed to address issues that we see are not really competition ones. And one really important point that I see there is, when we think about the concept of any type of ex-ante regulatory framework that really would address every perceived market problem, even before that arises, it just, it's an impossible exercise. Like, it just cannot happen. What we really have seen in history and learned from lessons of competition enforcement, regulation, and other policy areas is the core is, and the important objective is to build a system which is robust and competitive in your economy, in which you will hopefully have those results that Elisa also mentioned, whether it's the fintech type of like space, or developments in Brazil or other jurisdictions, whether it's national or regional companies that really have blossomed throughout, Latin America and have become important regional players. So I think it's so important to keep that in mind as one tries to think about this right balance between ex post competition enforcement and ex ante regulation. Now, a couple of things I wanted to follow up on, and I was taking notes, as Elisa also made this very important point about who regulates and who is actually the regulator, and not only who, but whether they have the resources, and in addition to, the antitrust enforcement resources, the broader human resources element as well that Elisa mentioned. I think it's a very important question in a number of jurisdictions, including in the region too. One sees that a few agencies, have been for the last few years to address potentially these challenges, in digital economy. They actually have been hiring more, like engineers, technology experts, data scientists, whether it's the UK CMA, whether it's the FTC's newly established Office of Technology. And it's a very important element to have a good understanding, a clear understanding of the very quickly moving and developing, business models, products that are being discussed and investigated here. But then even from the region, I think it's very important to look at, for example, Brazil's example. Brazil is discussing, at least, like in the Congress, a proposal for an ex-ante regulatory framework that is heavily inspired by the European DMA, the Digital Markets Act, and it follows a number of key provisions from the DMA. It also raised a number of important questions when it comes to even just who would regulate, going back to Elisa's question. For example, the Brazilian proposal puts down Anatel, the country's national telecommunications agency, as the regulator in case this, like DMA type proposal, regulatory proposal would go through, which again raised this very heavy debate and very detailed debate among Brazilian practitioners, regulators, legislators as well. Does the telecommunications agency in the country have the necessary resources, expertise to actually address these types of potential issues that often, again, have competition elements but may not be necessarily competition issues? And how will be the relationship then potentially with other enforcers, with CAGI, the country's competition authority, or with other enforcers in the country that might, again, potentially, if this proposal would go through, would play a role in the regulatory process. And just the last point I would wanted to make on following up on the theory of harm and the very important point of having or focusing on the toolkit that is already available for a particular jurisdiction, for a particular country. And I think Mexico's market investigation tool is an interesting example, like how it can and has been used potentially to address these issues. So it's so important for legislators, for regulators to look into what do we already have in the toolkit that we can use to address whatever the perceived market problem is. And do we already have what is needed to tackle and address those issues, whether it's through enforcement, whether it's through regulation, whether there's different types of regulation, and co-regulation was mentioned as another example, which just shows that there's no one-size-fits-all in that regard. And the very last point I would just close with on this particular point, focusing again more on the region and Latin America and potentially, emerging economies in this space, is that we really have to not forget that, there's a global competition for investment. Like, the key question when we also think about competition and regulation is, how do jurisdictions and individual economies, how do they want to position themselves in this global race for investment? Which can be very important because you obviously have a good sense of the fact that companies will very closely look at, and businesses look at, what kind of regulatory environments they would need to operate. What are the regulatory burdens? What are the fees? What excessive fees or regulatory burdens might lead to potentially less competition in the marketplace, because businesses very seriously consider those concerns. And on the other hand, it also is a very important element for national companies, whether it's startups, whether it's, fintech companies, whatever industrial sector they come from, regarding their global export competitiveness and how they can compete kind of like beyond the national borders at a regional or global level. Because I think it's important to keep in mind, to regulate competition, to be able to regulate competition, you must first attract it. So you want to make sure there's competition in the marketplace with which, you will be able to, consider different opportunities from a competition and regulatory perspective.
Thank you. Thank you, Krisztian, Elise and Daniel. I think that today's conversation and what we have discussed today sets an important base for our coming podcast, our coming project, and all the debates on the topics we're going to have. Today leaves us with a lot of questions to address, a lot of issues to take into account into this analysis. So I couldn't thank you more for setting the stage for this discussion we're going to be having over the next couple of weeks, and it's going to be available online for consultant by a lot of people, practitioners, legislators, academics, regarding these important trends on competition in Latin American countries. So thank you for your input. Thank you for joining us. And remember that Senti is here. You're always welcome to come back with further inputs. Probably we're going to be meeting in a couple of months to follow up on cases, development, and other aspects here or in any event we decide to organize. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.